Welcome to the onpoli podcast. I'm Steve Paikin.
And I'm John Michael McGrath.
Today on the pod, the Prime Minister and 5 premiers, including Doug Ford, are arguing over what the Notwithstanding clause does and does not mean.
A minister attending the wedding of a lobbyist is putting more scrutiny on the government's handling of a skills development fund.
The Premier is having a fight with a lot of mayors about those speed cameras, which the mayors want to keep, particularly in school zones, but Doug Ford wants to eliminate.
And in your column, my column, I'll look at the fight between the Premier and Diageo, a distiller who's closing their plant in the Southwest.
And I'll get you updated on who's kicking the tires on the Ontario Liberal leadership, including some intriguing names you may not know.
It's Friday, October 10th, 2025, so let's get to it.
JMM.
Steve.
A double sugar for today. Double sugar. How about those Blue Jays? Anyway, but before, let me just say, I've been doing a lot of yelling at the TV set lately, which is explaining the bad voice, so that's number one. Number two, we should explain to people, you and I do not kind of have a clothing meeting before deciding, you're going to wear this, I'm going to wear that. We both walked in today knowing that there was only one thing that we would have to wear tonight, and it wasn't going to be a shirt from some premier who served in 1870.
No,
right?
For once. Yes. So I'm wearing a hoodie of the Toronto Blue Jays, who, of course, defeated the New York Yankees earlier this week. They will be going to the ALCS, and we're very excited for that. First time in almost 10 years.
Yeah.
And you are...
Well, I don't keep a secret of this, but I don't advertise it either sometimes because it tends to get me in trouble here. But I've been a Red Sox fan since before the Blue Jays were born.
Yes.
I love the Blue Jays. I adore the Red Sox. But if there's one thing we can all be united in this moment, it is that whether you're a Red Sox fan or a Blue Jays fan, we love it when the Yankees lose.
Absolutely.
And so can you see my shirt here? Here we go. Yankees go home. That's exactly right. And they are now. They are going home.
Yes, they get to enjoy some time off while the Jays have a bit more hard work ahead of them.
They do indeed. 8 more wins for a World Series. Did you watch any of the post-game dressing room celebrations by chance?
I did not actually. We caught a bit of the shot of the celebration on field, and then I turned off the TV and I went to bed.
Okay. The reason I raise it is because apparently swearing is a big thing now on live television. And I heard more hyphenated words last night from the Blue Jays clubhouse after the game was over, from the manager, from Kevin Gossman. Anyway, on and on it went. And, I guess it's fine. I guess it's fine.
Yeah, well, I'm not even sure what the regulations are these days, but I remember... in the last round of this, there was also some colorful language, and people were speculating that, Rogers, who, of course, the broadcaster that owns the Blue Jays, is going to end up having to pay so many fines for their language that they'll end up barely breaking even for all the TV revenues.
You know what? If they win the World Series, I bet they'll be happy to write that check.
Yes.
I think so.
Yes.
Okay, let's continue here, and let's just take a minute to talk about, it's actually funny, the first time Mark Carney and Donald Trump had that meeting in the White House several months ago, it was really a very big deal. It was big news.
Yeah.
And they met again, of course, earlier this week, and it seemed to be kind of, less impactful as a news story. What was your takeaway?
Yeah, it seems to have sort of come and gone without making a huge impression. I think in part that's because they didn't seem to get we didn't seem to get a lot out of the meeting, but let's start with what we would have once thought was just obvious. But the Prime Minister did not get Zelensky'd, as the verb we're now using, right?
I think it's a participle. He did not get Zelensky'd, which means
he didn't get ambushed,
right. Humiliated, picked on by everybody in the Oval Office. Right.
Yeah.
Didn't happen.
We have Dominic LeBlanc, the federal minister in charge of these trade negotiations, is staying in Washington with other Canadian representatives to work on a deal. There is some question, of course, about what the structure of any deal with America could possibly look like right now, with a president who loves tariffs the way I love my wife and child. There's some speculation that Canada could end up receiving a slightly lower tariff rate if we agree to export quotas. That basically we would limit the number of exports that we make to the United States. That would allow us to keep the share of our current exports, but wouldn't allow us to grow them any. That obviously puts our economy at some kind of a disadvantage, but at least in the short term, it might be worth it if it takes tariffs off the board, or at least lowers the tariffs that we're talking about. So that's sort of one element of what we're seeing right now.
I think the comments that the president makes about Canada becoming the 51st state rank number one for the most disgraceful thing that he says when he's with Mark Carney. But I'm guessing a close second, particularly for the province of Ontario, where so much auto manufacturing takes place, is the fact that Donald Trump says, you know what, we're going to be number one in auto assembly. Yeah. And if you want to be number two and just sort of take our scraps, that's fine, but we're going to be number one. And that's going to be a problem, both for the government of Canada, the government of Ontario, not to mention the auto industry and the auto parts industry, yeah, and all the spin-offs, because we've laid all our chips in the middle of the table on the auto industry.
Yeah, and so Global News has reported that the Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, has told Canadian representatives that, this is what America first, Canada second means, that we're just going to have to deal with a president who, frankly, just believes that all of Canada's auto jobs should properly be in America, and anything that we happen to incidentally have, that might be okay, but really, they should all go to America first. There are some additional little elements that have come out in the reporting here that I find interesting, and maybe our audience will as well. Lutnick also apparently said that this matter of American booze being kept off of LCBO shelves, that's not something that has gone without notice in the U.S. They have noticed, they have felt the pain. The state of Kentucky would really quite like to have bourbon back on the shelves here in Ontario. The Americans want that addressed before they agree to any normalization. The Premier has said, that's not on. That we're only going to talk about the LCBO shelves being restocked with American booze after there's some kind of an agreement. Mark Carney has no way to actually move the Premier on this. He can't legislate what is on LCBO shelves or anything. This is just purely a matter of provincial jurisdiction. So unless Doug Ford has a change of heart, that's not going anywhere.
Yeah. We do remember quite well Mark Carney the first time around, telling the president that as a real estate expert, you would know, Mr. President, that there are some things that are not for sale, and Canada is one of them. And yet the 51st state nonsense came up once again during this meeting. What the heck is going on?
It was treated as a joke. I thought Carney sort of laughed it off as that we didn't actually discuss that. But this stuff remains not funny to most Canadians.
Right.
And, there was, of course, one moment where perhaps the only time that you and I have something in common with Mark Carney and Donald Trump, they also discussed baseball.
Right.
And Trump said that the Blue Jays are looking pretty good.
You think?
A rare, accurate observation from the current occupant. And they have just beat the Yankees. So before we move on to issue one, we can just say, go Jays.
Go Jays. And what do we love to say? The Yankees lose. There we go. Off to issue one. Notwithstanding anything JMM and I discuss in this segment, the Prime Minister and the Premier of Ontario are having a dispute over the notwithstanding clause of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. See what I did there?
I do,
Isn't
yes.
that clever? Yeah. That is the clause that essentially allows governments to set aside certain charter rights for a 5-year period if those governments disagree with a court's decision. Okay, what's the problem here?
So the case we are discussing here centers on Quebec's Bill 21, just one of several so-called secularism laws that different Quebec governments have brought forward over the past decade. This one, introduced by the Legault government in 2019, invoked the notwithstanding clause to require public servants, including teachers, not to wear obvious signs of religious devotion. So I think it's uncontroversial at this point to say that the burden of this law falls primarily on Muslim and Jewish Quebecers, and most particularly on Muslim women who are under this law forbidden from wearing headscarves and that kind of religious garb. So the law is being challenged by, among others, the National Council of Canadian Muslims, as well as Montreal's Public English Language School Board. Two lower courts have already determined that since the Quebec National Assembly invoked the Notwithstanding clause, there's functionally nothing more for them to say. They're really like, okay, Notwithstanding clause is invoked. That means we can't rule on it. But the matter is now before the Supreme Court for consideration.
Many governments in Quebec from all different party stripes have used the Notwithstanding clause over the years.
Yes.
They've used it more than any other province. So here we are again. We have a Quebec law that has been heard in Quebec courts, and we are waiting to find out what the Supreme Court of Canada has to say about all this. So why has this Quebec case seized the attention of the Premier of Ontario, and for that matter, several others as well?
So the key dispute that the Supreme Court will be asked to rule on is what, if any, limits the Constitution places on the use of the Notwithstanding clause. So just to give people a refresher here, this is Section 33 of the 1981 Constitution Act, which says that Sections 2 and 7 through 15 of the Charter can be temporarily overridden by Parliament or the provincial legislatures if they invoke it when they pass the legislation. So the Premier of a province cannot step out in front of the cameras on any given Monday and just say, okay, Notwithstanding clause invoked. It has to be done through legislation. Multiple provinces have used the Notwithstanding clause, including Ontario. The federal parliament never has to date. Now, that's not to say that Ottawa doesn't have interests in this case, right? This is a constitutional issue that the Supreme Court is going to have to decide on. So Ottawa and all the other provinces have made their opinions known. And the federal government filed a factum, which is sort of like a summary of the arguments they want to make before the court. And they have said, this is the Federal Attorney General's office, has said that actually the court should look at what, if any, limits should be imposed on the use of Section 33. What kind of limits might be implicit based on its structure within the rest of the Constitution. So just as one example, they say, like, if a province repeatedly invokes the Notwithstanding clause in 5-year chunks, as the text of the Constitution allows them to, but if they just keep doing that forever, then functionally, this is the question they ask, is that province not functionally amending the Charter of Rights and Freedoms to just extinguish certain rights, right? So that's the kind of question that the federal government is asking the Supreme Court to answer. And to put it mildly, the conservative premiers of this country really did not like that intervention in this case at all.
Well, there is a legitimate difference of opinion here. You know, there are those who believe, as Doug Ford does, and he is the one and only Ontario Premier who has used the Notwithstanding clause.
Yes. None
of his predecessors did during the 4+ decades in which the clause was available. You know, they believe the clause is in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and if it's there to be used. So they don't have any difficulty using it whatsoever. We're about to check a box here, but I can certainly recall back in the day talking to former Premier Bill Davis, who was, frankly, one of the premiers 40+ years ago who helped orchestrate a compromise between Pierre Trudeau and the so-called Gang of 8 premiers who didn't want the Charter. And Mr. Davis's view, and the view of many at the time, was, well, the political consequences of using this will be so significant that no government will want to use it. And of course, he never did, and neither did any of his successors until Doug Ford. I think one of the things we've learned in the era of Trump is that, you know, people have lives to lead, and they are dealing with 85 different things during the course of any day, and therefore the political consequences of using the Notwithstanding clause are non-existent. And therefore, it seems the Premier is content to use this clause whenever he wants to. Having said that, that clause was part of the compromise that got the deal 43 years ago.
Yes.
And therefore, we've got a debate today, right?
Right. And I think it's fair to say the Conservative premiers don't just have history on their side. They've got Supreme Court precedent on their side. The only other time the court looked at the question of the proper use of the Notwithstanding clause was in a 1988 decision called Ford v. Quebec, although it did not involve either the current premier or the automaker. It was a different Ford. But the court then said, so long as it is invoked properly, expressly with legislation, there's no obvious limit in the text of the Constitution to how the Notwithstanding clause can be used. Again, so long as it's restricted to those named sections that we've talked about. And Ontario's argument, which is also in a factum before the Supreme Court that people can read on the Supreme Court's website, is that the Ford case is still good law and should be upheld and should not be overturned by any decisions in this Bill 21 case.
Given that the clause exists and it is legal to use, how do we not just conclude that the provinces are right, the feds are wrong, and let's all go home and forget about it?
Well, so there is one other argument here that I wanted to draw people's attention to, because we always remind our audience that I am not a lawyer, but I
just play one on television.
Yeah. But I do think this one may end up being more important. So there is Section 28 of the Charter that says rights are guaranteed equally to male and female persons, notwithstanding anything else in the Charter. Section 28 sits outside of those sections that the Notwithstanding clause is allowed to override. Right? Now, historically, that just hasn't mattered. It hasn't come up in a way that has mattered in previous judicial decisions. But given that, as I mentioned, I think it's uncontroversial to say that the burden of Bill 21 falls most heavily on Muslim women, Section 28's guarantee of gender equality and that no use of the Notwithstanding clause can override Section 28 could be an important part of the court's decisions here. And here I'm basing this off of the work of Carrie Frock, a law professor at the University of New Brunswick. She's had a lot of really interesting work on this and about the history of why Section 28 was adopted the way it was. She argues that basically this was a demand of feminist advocates during the whole charter drafting process to ensure exactly this, that female equality could not be overridden with the Notwithstanding clause. People can Google her to find out more. But we'll see how this goes. But this is the interesting argument.
And one last thing. Does the province of Ontario actually have an official position that they've presented to the court on this?
Right. So this is part of their factum. They argue that Section 28 isn't really meant to create a separate pillar in the Charter, guaranteeing rights that are not already spelled out in other parts like Section 7, which guarantees equality rights. So just to sort of spell this out a bit more clearly, if Ontario is right, then the Notwithstanding clause can be used to pass laws that treat men and women unequally. This is, to me, I think, the most interesting argument, because now the Supreme Court might not be looking to upend our use of the Notwithstanding clause. They might just decide that this is not something that they need to revise, that as the Conservative premiers want to see, they'll just let the existing precedent stand. If they are looking to place limits on the use of the Notwithstanding clause, this is where I think they may do it. The particular structure of Section 28 and some other more recent decisions, this might be where they do impose some limits, and it would mean striking out seemingly very large parts of Quebec's Bill 21. Ironically, as agitated as certainly as Doug Ford has been this week, releasing this letter opposing the federal intervention, it would not affect anything in Ontario law, at least directly, at least not on the Section 28 issue.
Is this where we put the proviso on the record again, though, that you are not a lawyer and you just never know how this is going to roll out?
Yes, no, and people can feel free to mock me to their heart's content if I am proven wrong by events.
Mock you? We would never mock you. Well, no, let me think. No, we might mock you. We might. Let's see how that goes. Okay, notwithstanding that discussion, we're moving on to issue 2.
Absolutely.
We had Ontario NDP leader Marit Stiles on the podcast last week, and we spoke about the controversy surrounding the province's handling of the Skills Development Fund grants. A week later, our friends at the Trillium are reporting that Ontario's Labour Minister, David Paikin, attended the wedding of a lobbyist whose clients received millions in funding. The Auditor General's report on the fund has said that the selection process was, quote, not fair, transparent, or accountable, and that the minister's office selected what companies to fund. Okay, what else do we need to know here?
So according to the Trillium sources, Labour Minister David Paikin attended the wedding of lobbyist Michael Rotherham in Paris. They have reportedly been friends for a long time. It's not unusual for ministers to have friends who become lobbyists or to become friends with lobbyists. It happens, but obviously the optics of this are not spectacular for the government. On the accountability aspect here, the Auditor General's report found that many applications that were rated high in terms of their alignment with the formal sort of objectives of this skills development program did not receive funding, while many companies that were in the poor or lowest categories did receive funding, and often specifically after interventions by the minister's office. So the lower-ranked companies received $742 million in funding, while 670 high-ranked applications received zero. So two companies that had Rotherham's help received $8.5 million in grants, according to the Auditor General.
Well, okay. Let's play this out a little bit here. There are essentially two schools of thought in how monies are dispersed in circumstances like this. One is that it's a Simon Pure process. You get points depending on your application, and whoever wins the most points, has got the best price, has got the most talented people associated, etc. The public service, with no political intervention, just simply counts up the scores and gives the contract to the best bidder.
Ideally, it would almost be like a spreadsheet function.
Precisely. There is, of course, another school of thought which says ministers are ultimately accountable for the decisions that happen in their departments, and they can put their thumb on the scale for whoever they want if they're prepared to suffer the political consequences. We've already talked about the fact that oftentimes these days there are no political consequences for a whole bunch of reasons. So, where are we on this issue of whether the minister should or should not be involved?
There's always going to be more people who want public money than there is public money to go around, right? So the question necessarily becomes, how do you decide? And in other provinces, the elected political people who administer funds like this are kept at a certain arm's length. And they do allow the political, or the non-political staff, I should say, more leeway to make the determinations about where that money goes. Now, their work is still overseen by an elected minister, because I know our audience. I will say, of course, ministers are not elected; they are appointed. But the government is accountable to the elected legislature. The Auditor General did recommend more transparency in the process and a clear line of accountability and some separation between the minister and the funding decisions. Now, the government seems to have agreed with that recommendation. To my read, the government always appends these notes to the Auditor General report saying, we agree with this recommendation, and then they spell out how they're implementing these things. My read of it seemed to stop short of agreeing to a clear, bright line division between the minister and the funding decisions, but we will see how this proceeds in perhaps future audits.
Well, Mart Stiles, the NDP leader, was in that chair last week, and we did ask her if she intended to take this to the Integrity Commissioner and get that commissioner to investigate this thing. I gather she is still mulling that question.
Yes.
So we haven't heard the last of this, I suspect, is where we're at now.
Yes, I suspect, if nothing else, it's going to come up quite a bit at question period in a few weeks.
Absolutely. And with that, we're off to issue 3. See if you can follow the bouncing ball on this one. 6 years ago, the Ontario government set the rules for allowing municipalities to put in speed cameras to ensure drivers would slow down and drive more safely. The program worked. People drove noticeably more slowly, and those that sped had to pay fines, which municipalities appreciated. They prefer to raise revenue that way rather than raising property taxes on everyone. Then Premier Ford decided the cameras were a cash grab, so he announced he'd be banning them. Then a big group of mayors wrote him asking him to reconsider the camera ban. And the Premier said, "No, I won't." Let's dive in. What are the mayors asking for?
So 20 municipalities across Ontario signed a letter penned by Burlington Mayor Marianne Mead Ward and Brampton Mayor Patrick Brown. They asked for an exemption to the ban on automated speed enforcement cameras, what we are calling speed cameras here, placed in school zones. They also said that they would support changes to the cameras, including the first ticket being a warning and setting more reasonable thresholds before a ticket is issued. But they really did want to insist on, at least if we can't keep speed cameras more generally, at least keeping them in school zones. The letter did also invoke the sick kid study we've referred to previously on the podcast that showed that cameras do slow drivers down. The letter notes that in a collision at 30 kilometers an hour, a pedestrian has a 90% chance of survival, while in a collision at 45 kilometers an hour, pedestrians only have a 50% chance of survival.
What's interesting about that note is Marianne Mead Ward is not necessarily, I mean, she gets on with the premier, but you wouldn't call her one of his closest allies.
No.
But Patrick Brown from Brampton is.
Yeah.
And Carolyn Parrish from Mississauga is. They are two of the mayors in this province who are really close allies with the premier, and yet they are against him on this one.
And I would just add, Ottawa Mayor Mark Sutcliffe did not sign this letter, but he did come out this week and say he disagrees with the mayor and similarly wants to keep speed cameras in school zones.
Okay, so where's the premier on this now?
Basically, no. That is the answer. I have the image, if people remember the movie Gladiator, of the barbarian tribe coming out from the forest and the Roman general just being, the answer is no. The ban is going to go ahead. And the government saying that they will be making money available for traffic calming measures like speed bumps and flashing signs. It is worth mentioning in this context that speed cameras work in some areas where you can't do speed bumps, right? Like we don't put speed bumps on like major arterial roads, but you can put a speed camera there. And yes, there are schools that face on or are very near arterial roads, and keeping those roads safe is part of keeping students safe. I was feeling a bit nostalgic this week. The issue was debated at Toronto City Council, and the level of debate at Toronto City Council is not always spectacular. I will concede that, but the caliber of debate, in part because you have elected councillors questioning staff who are functionally the subject matter experts that they rely on. They are questioning staff. They're getting facts on the record. It's just a much higher level of debate on a topic like this in particular. Certainly a higher caliber than you get from either question period or even a premier's press conference.
Huh. Okay. Well, if this story weren't problematic enough, we go further.
Yes.
Here we go. Global News reported that vehicles registered to Doug Ford's cabinet ministers have been caught by speed cameras at least 20 times. One ticket somebody was doing 70 in a 40.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean, we should hasten to add, that the cabinet minister was driving. It's probably likely the cabinet minister wasn't driving. They could use the vehicle independently, so you don't know.
Yeah.
But the fact is, those cars, with whoever was driving, owe the municipalities $3,300 for blowing past speed cameras.
Yes.
Any chance they're going to collect that money?
I suspect not. Somebody on Twitter was joking at me that it's a new form of provincial municipal transfer. We should mention that Global News found this out through a Freedom of Information request. The province has FOI coordinators. These are public servants who are charged with complying with the provincial law. It's their job to go to the minister's office and say, okay, we've had a request for X, Y, and Z documents, turn over what you've got. But in this case, the coordinators declined to release the names of these specific drivers, saying that it could put individuals at risk. That is a valid exemption under the law. These decisions can be challenged. I don't know if Global is going to try and challenge that. But obviously, if we just pull back for a moment, once again, the optics of something like this are not great. I don't think it's going to sway the premier in his determination, but the rest of us watching from outside can perhaps have a chuckle about what it means for the government's determination.
$3,300 is not going to break the premier's bank either way.
No. I mean, he could pay that personally. He's a man of some means.
Indeed. Off to your column, my column. Time now for our regular feature, Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I reminisce about what we wrote for TVO.org over the past week. Tell us all about your column, my friend.
Have you ever heard the phrase kicking the dog?
Yeah.
It's like a man gets yelled at by his boss. He goes home and he can't yell at his wife. He can't yell at his kids, so he kicks the dog,
Yeah.
right? An analogy or a metaphor or whatever it is, an image of frustration, and the poor dog is getting abuse for no reason.
Who's the dog in this case?
The distiller Diageo, who have not done nothing to earn people's ire. They are closing a plant in Amherstburg that is going to put something like 200 workers out of a job. And Premier Doug Ford has rather famously decided this is a fight he wants. He poured out the bottle of Crown Royal at a press conference a while back, and now he's saying that if Diageo goes forward with this closure, not only will he take Crown Royal bottles off of the LCBO shelves, that he's going to look at other Diageo brands, including potentially Smirnoff vodka. And so I will say that, of course, I have a lot of sympathy for these workers who are looking at potentially being out of work, and I don't even begrudge the Premier for taking the side of the workers in this kind of a dispute. But I did want to just put this in the context of there are lots of other places around the province right now where workers' livelihoods are in danger, and the Premier is picking this fight because it is a relatively small one that he thinks he can win or at least look good in. But for example, like GM is currently their announced plan is to get rid of one of their shifts at the Oshawa vehicle assembly plant, and that will affect 10 times as many workers as we're talking about in this Diageo plant. Now, why is Ford not making threats against GM? Well, because GM's much larger, and GM can impose way more economic pain on Ontario if it decides that we're not worth its trouble.
And what's he going to do? Is he going to drive a GM product into a wall to show how upset he is?
Well, the point I make in the column is, we don't have like a provincial, automobile monopoly, but the province buys a ton of vehicles between just the ministries directly, right? They buy vehicles, but also the province determines the procurement rules for municipalities and school boards and police forces, right? All of those governments and agencies, they all buy lots and lots of cars. If the Premier wanted to threaten GM, he has the means to do so. He is not doing so. I think it's probably good that he's not doing so, but I also think that's valuable context for people to understand this whole Diageo spat.
I've heard another angle on this story, which is to say Diageo is in 2 other provinces and still doing business in those provinces and employing people, and they're not abandoning Canada.
No.
They're just, they're shutting down a plant in southwestern Ontario, which, as you point out, is not great for the people there. But it is passing strange, some would suggest, that the Premier is picking on a company which actually wants to continue to do business, admittedly, in 2 other provinces. But, if we're going to reduce interprovincial trade barriers, you're going to win some, you're going to lose some. That's the way it is.
Yes, absolutely. And even I think other conservative observers are also starting to get a little bit uncomfortable with the idea of a Premier using the LCBO so visibly as a crowbar to dictate terms to private businesses.
Right. Okay, I'm following up on, of course, the departure of Bonnie Crombie in the Ontario Liberal leadership position, and now that that job has been vacant for a few weeks, we are starting to see some candidates out there kicking the tires on whether or not they want to run. There's 2 schools of thought, at least initially, on this. One is that both Crombie and Stephen Del Duca, the leader before her, were unable to win seats during general elections. And as a result, there will be some Liberal Party members who think, you know what, if you've got a seat, that's really good. And as a result, they are looking at people like Adel Shamji or Lee Fairclough or Ted Hsu, Stephanie Bowman, Rob Serjanik. They are all people who have seats in the caucus at Queen's Park right now. And if having a seat is important to you, well, those are some candidacies that, may or may not happen down the road, but we shall see. Their having seats certainly takes away from the issue that Del Duca and Crombie had.
And I do think, if nothing else, that might end up being important because, they've spent so many years now having to have this issue litigated during their problems that just having somebody with a seat in the legislature, if nothing else, it would just end the conversation for a little while.
It would end that conversation. However, there are those who believe that if having a seat is the biggest metric by which you're making your decision, you are not going to consider a bunch of other candidates who bring a lot to the table and who may ultimately be better. I'm offering no view on this one way or the other, but suffice to say, there are a lot of other names out there that are kind of intriguing, people who are looking at this thing right now. The name Danielle Martin, a family doctor who runs a big family medicine department at the University of Toronto. She is a medical superstar. She has gone down to the States and testified at a Senate committee and put some Republican senators in their place when she was down there testifying.
Yes.
She's a very impressive person, and she is interested in considering a run. Yeah. Dr. Andrew Buzari, who I think got a lot of attention during COVID. He was on TV a lot explaining things, was a healthcare advisor in Kathleen Wynne's government. He works for the Gattuso Center for Social Medicine at the University Health Network. He's another guy who's considering it. Karina Gould is a name that will be familiar to many people. She's got an exploratory committee out there. She ran against Mark Carney for the federal Liberal leadership. She's chair of the Finance Committee in Ottawa right now, having been dropped from his cabinet. She's 38, young family. You know, if we're looking at generational change, all of the people I just mentioned represent some of that generational change. And I got to put one more name on the record here, and that is Nate Erskine-Smith.
Yes.
And he is probably the most controversial candidate because, if he gets in, because he is a guy who inspires great loyalty, because he's pretty good on policy. He's a fairly charismatic figure. You know, if you're looking sort of for the choice of the next generation, he's a young guy, 41 years old, I think. There are, however, a lot of people in the party who are very upset with Erskine-Smith because he's the guy who sort of put the shiv into Bonnie Crombie and, you know, really was not helpful to her leadership prospects. It is often the case in politics that he who kills the king doesn't get to be the next king.
Yes.
But, you know, the party has still not yet made rules. They have not yet said when the convention is going to happen. Obviously, those who are well organized and ready to go would like a short runway so they could hit the ground running. Others who have not yet put organizations together and would like a chance to compete for this thing say, what's the hurry? We're not going to be another election for 3.5 years. Let's take our time and really consider all the potential candidates. So anyway, it's starting to coalesce, and I find it all very interesting.
You know, and it will be interesting to see who, either among those names or, you know, maybe somebody we haven't named yet, comes forward. You know, as I said, when Crombie announced her resignation, you know, for the first time maybe since 2013, I think we're going to see a much more competitive leadership race because, you know, obviously the Liberal Party still has its weaknesses, still the third party in the legislature, but I do think there's a perception that the party is a prize worth trying for now that it wasn't in previous contests unless you were truly devoted to the party, you know, like Stephen Del Duca, you know, was frankly had been angling for the leadership before the leadership even became vacant. So, yeah.
There, you mentioned the 2013 Liberal leadership, which was held at what we used to call Maple Leaf Gardens.
Yeah.
And there was a bit of a reunion of some of the candidates from that recently. At Jim Bradley's funeral, a couple of Saturdays ago in St. Catharines, Kathleen Wynne was there, Sandra Pupatella was there, Charles Sousa was there, Gerard Kennedy was there, Harinder Thakkar was not there. Yeah. But I thought we were going to have a little reunion of the 2013 Liberal leadership, and Sandra Pupatella and Kathleen Wynne, who were kind of bitter rivals in that race, actually had a very lovely hug as they greeted one another at Mr. Bradley's funeral. So there we go. Jim Bradley bringing people together, even in death.
Very nice.
Now, should we go to the mailbag?
Let's do it.
Okay. If you've got a burning question or insightful comment, please send it along to onpolitics@tvo.org. JMM, fire away.
We have a question here from a Blue Sky user, Indiana Justice, who asks, do we think there will be any tangible fallout for members of Ford's cabinet being caught speeding, including 30 kilometers over the limit? Do we know if Ontarians technically paid these fees?
Well, okay, I'm going to go back to what I said a moment ago, or several moments ago, about in this era of Trump, one thing that we have learned is that if voters love you, they'll let you get away with anything. Trump, of course, has bragged about I could walk down Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and get away with it. He's kind of obliterated all norms and conventions in the past. He's engorged himself on emoluments, essentially the gifts you get, like big jumbo jets, when you're in that job. Much of this stuff is completely inappropriate behavior, and yet he gets away with it because he's got a base of support in the United States that says, we don't care about any of that stuff. You're our guy, and you can do whatever you want. Now, I'm not going to make too much of a comparison between Trump and Ford, but Premier Ford has said he wants to get rid of these speed cameras, so it's hard to imagine that he will impose any sanctions on anyone who's run afoul of them. I don't know if the province is going to pay these fines. Does anybody know if the province actually intends to pay the municipalities the $3,300 they owe for those fines?
So no, I haven't seen that reported anywhere. There's a few things that occur to me on this question. One is that when the government introduces legislation to remove these speed cameras, it's a bit of a constitutional weirdness, but the legislature can introduce laws with retroactive effect. And so constitutionally, there is nothing stopping Doug Ford from introducing a law that says any minister of the Crown or their driver who was issued a ticket between dates X and Y does not have to pay these tickets.
It's good to be the king.
That's one option.
It's good to be the king.
Yeah. I mean, I almost hate to sort of speak it out into the world to give people ideas, but it is one potential option. I mean, the conventional wisdom here would be that if you're and again, I want to reiterate that we don't know for a fact that the cabinet ministers themselves were driving these vehicles, but somebody drawing a public salary seems to be a likely candidate, right? Either the minister or they have drivers, and in one sense, either the government of Ontario could pay these fines on behalf of their the driver, or the driver themselves, who is taking a public salary, is paying their, like, when I buy these sweaters, I is the Ontario taxpayer paying for them? Well, no, I'm paying for them, but the Ontario taxpayer pays my salary. So, it's fundamentally, how you draw these lines is a bit arbitrary. It might come out who ends up paying for it, but I haven't seen that so far. In terms of the political consequences, unfortunately, I'm pretty sort of cynical on this point. I don't expect it to have a huge outcome, except that, these things do sort of build up, and, you've got this little data point, and then you've got the labor minister going to the lobbyist wedding. And of course, the government had a previous wedding where lobbyists were present with the premier's daughter. And as these things start to build up, you start to get a perception of impunity. And I think the government wants to be careful about that. I don't think that this specific thing will be fatal to their politics, but you want to keep an eye on this stuff.
Mm-hmm. That is indeed the case. Okay, let's give the email address and get out of here.
Right. Again, if you'd like to ask about the content on the show, you can always email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And that is the onpoli podcast for this Friday, October 10th, 2025. Happy Thanksgiving weekend, everybody.
You can follow our show on Apple Podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available, and you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel. We also have turned the comments on there, so you can leave us a note there.
Any feedback you have, we're always happy to hear it. Good, bad, or indifferent. Write us an email at onpolitics@tvo.org. Please be sure to include your first and last name and where you're located.
This week's episode was produced and edited by Matthew O'Mara, video editing by Colin Kish.
Production support from Jonathan Hallowell and TVO's Digital Media Services team.
Laurie Few is the executive producer of Digital. John Ferry is vice president, programming and content.
As we thank the studio crew for always setting us up so nicely here, I want to give a final shout out to Michael Kay, who is the voice of the New York Yankees. And whenever the Yankees win, Michael Kay always ends his broadcast by saying, "The Yankees win. The Yankees win." And so, John Michael, would you join me in one final, the Yankees lose? Amen to that. Until next Friday, everybody. Bye-bye.